It's a minor inconvenience are a small price to pay for the reassurance that comes from...
A high-stakes briefing behind closed doors suddenly turned hostile. Queen Camilla stood inside the private library at Windsor Castle and directly challenged Princess Anne's authority in front of shocked household staff. King Charles completely lost his composure, slamming his hand down and unleashing a furious outburst that stunned the room. The fragile peace inside the palace shattered instantly. This raw, unprecedented shouting match exposed the deepest power struggle in modern royal history. The morning briefing shuts down. A heavy porcelain teacup rattled against its saucer. The sound was sharp. It broke the steady murmur of voices inside the king's private library. The room was warm. Light streamed through the high windows, illuminating dust motes over the mahogany table. 6 people sat around the wood. At the head sat King Charles. To his right was Queen Camilla. Directly opposite them sat Princess Anne. The date was October 14th, 2025. It was a standard Tuesday morning administrative briefing. 3 senior household secretaries stood near the door. They held digital tablets and paper schedules. These workers were used to administrative debates. They were not prepared for a total breakdown of royal decorum. The meeting began normally. The group reviewed the upcoming autumn diary. They discussed charity patronages and international visits. Then, a senior aide walked forward. He placed a newly bound dark blue ledger in the center of the table. This document contained the revised royal master schedule for the next calendar year. It was a roadmap for the family's public appearances. Camilla reached out. She pulled the ledger toward her side of the table. Her fingers flicked through the heavy pages. She stopped at the section marked for the spring tour. She leaned forward, placing her palm flat on the paper. She looked directly at Anne. Her tone was measured, but it carried an undeniable edge. She questioned the heavy concentration of high-profile public engagements assigned to the Princess Royal. The facts of the diary were undisputed. Anne regularly completed over 400 public engagements a year. She was consistently named the hardest-working member of the royal family. She managed a massive portfolio of charities, military regiments, and public institutions. Her schedule was relentless. It required meticulous planning and extensive travel across the country. Camilla proposed a structural change. She suggested that the public profile of the monarchy needed a modern layout. She argued that a streamlined, smaller core of working royals was more effective. In practice, this meant reducing Anne's public calendar by 1/3. The proposed plan would redistribute several high-profile military patronages. They would go to a centralized pool managed by the Queen's office. The room grew completely quiet. The secretaries by the door did not move a muscle. Anne sat perfectly straight in her chair. Her posture was rigid, refined by decades of public service under her mother, Queen Elizabeth II. She did not blink. She looked at the ledger, then raised her eyes to meet Camilla's gaze. The tension between the two women was instant. It filled the historic room like a physical weight. Anne rejected the proposal with 2 words. She called the plan entirely unworkable. Her voice was calm but freezing. She stated that the patronages were not personal trophies to be moved on a spreadsheet. They represented long-term commitments to working-class British communities. She argued that cutting back these appearances would send a disastrous signal to the public. It would look like the family was retreating from its duties. Camilla did not back down. She countered that the current pace was unsustainable for the institution's budget. She pointed out that travel expenses and security costs for multiple independent royal households were rising. She argued that the public expected efficiency, not outdated numbers. She claimed her office needed total oversight of all major public deployments to avoid scheduling conflicts. The argument shifted from logistics to authority. Camilla was speaking as the Queen Consort, claiming the right to shape the modern household. Anne was speaking from 50 years of unbroken service on the front lines of the monarchy. She reminded the table that the strength of the crown lay in its continuity, not in superficial public relations updates. She refused to yield a single military appointment. Charles watched the exchange from the center of the table. His fingers twitched against his gold signet ring. He looked exhausted. The pressure of his current reign had been mounting for months, compounded by state duties and internal family rifts. He had tried to remain a neutral arbiter between his wife and his sister. That neutrality was dissolving fast. The secretaries exchanged uneasy glances. They knew the history. The rivalry between Anne and Camilla was not new. It dated back decades, rooted in different philosophies about royal work and private life. This morning, those old differences were colliding in real time over a piece of administrative paperwork. The administrative briefing was no longer about dates and locations. It had become an open power struggle for the heart of the royal operation. The aide who brought the ledger took a quiet step backward toward the exit. His shoe squeaked slightly on the polished floorboards. The noise seemed to amplify the silence that followed Anne's final remark. Camilla's hand remained on the blue book. She turned to her husband, clearly expecting him to validate her authority as queen. Anne simply waited, her arms crossed, her eyes locked on the king. The mechanism of the palace was grinding to a halt in the middle of a Tuesday morning. The ledger that sparked the fire. The blue leather binder remained flat on the table between the two women. Queen Camilla tapped her manicured index finger against the gold lettering on the cover. The document was titled, "The Sovereign Deployment Strategy." It was prepared by a private consultancy firm hired by her personal staff. The firm specialized in corporate streamlining, and they had applied that exact logic to the ancient framework of the British monarchy. Anne leaned forward, her elbows resting on the polished wood. She did not touch the binder. Instead, she demanded that Camilla flip to page 42. That specific page contained the core of the dispute. It listed a comprehensive reallocation of 3 highly prestigious honorary military roles. These were titles that Anne had held for decades, granted to her directly by her late mother. The first title was the Colonel-in-Chief of the King's Royal Hussars. The second was the Honorary Air Commodore of Royal Air Force Bryce Norton. The third was the Royal Colonel of the Royal Regiment of Scotland. These were not merely symbolic honors listed on a website. They required active participation, regular visits to barracks, and attendance at highly sensitive military ceremonies. Anne took these duties incredibly seriously, often spending days traveling to remote bases in freezing weather. The ledger proposed transferring all 3 positions directly to Camilla's portfolio. The rationale listed in the corporate text was simple. The analysts argued that centering major military patronages under the Queen Consort would create a more unified public image for the reign. It would give the appearance of a focused, singular leadership at the top of the family tree. Anne's voice dropped an octave, becoming dangerously quiet. She stated that the military would find the changes insulting. She argued that soldiers value consistency and genuine interest, not superficial public relations maneuvers. She pointed out that she had built personal relationships with those regiments over 50 years of service. She asked Camilla directly if she had ever even visited the barracks at Bryce Norton without a camera crew present. The question was a direct hit. It exposed the raw nerve of the entire dispute. Camilla's expression hardened. She countered that the monarchy could no longer be run like a collection of independent fiefdoms. She stated that her office was tasked with modernizing the public profile of the institution. She argued that the distribution of honors must reflect the current hierarchy of the crown, not historical sentimentality. Charles sat perfectly still between them. His eyes were fixed on the silver inkwell in front of him. He looked visibly smaller under the weight of the argument. He had been briefed on the ledger weeks prior by Camilla's chief of staff, but he had not given his definitive approval. He had hoped the details could be smoothed over by assistants before reaching a formal meeting. Now, his hesitation had backfired completely, forcing him to witness a raw confrontation between his wife and his sister. The household staff near the door stood like statues. Their training kicked in, allowing them to mask their absolute shock behind blank expressions. One secretary noted the time on his digital watch. It was exactly 10:15. The schedule for the day was already running 20 minutes behind. A delegation from the Commonwealth Secretariat was waiting in the drawing room downstairs, entirely unaware of the civil war erupting on the floor above them. The argument deepened when Camilla asserted that the changes had already been discussed with senior officials at the Ministry of Defense. She claimed that the government preferred a more centralized approach to royal military appearances to cut down on security costs. This assertion was a massive tactical error. It implied that she had gone over Anne's head to coordinate with government ministers before presenting the plan to the family. Anne's posture became even more rigid. She looked at her brother and asked if he had authorized his wife to negotiate with state departments regarding his sister's personal honors. The question forced Charles into a corner. If he admitted he knew, he would look complicit in a betrayal of his sister. If he denied it, he would look completely out of control of his own household staff. The king did not answer right away. He reached for a glass of water, his hand shaking slightly. The ice cubes clinked loudly against the glass, a clear sign of his rising agitation. The room was heating up, both literally and figuratively. The palace machinery was completely deadlocked over 3 lines on a spreadsheet, and the silence from the monarch was only making the environment more volatile. Camilla pressed her advantage. She stated that the ledger was a necessary evolution for the survival of the crown. She looked around the table, explicitly calling on the senior secretaries to validate her point about budget efficiency. The workers looked down at their boots, completely refusing to take a side in a dispute that could end their careers. Nobody wanted to get caught in the crossfire between the Queen and the Princess Royal. Anne closed her notebook with a sharp slap. She told Camilla that her definition of evolution looked remarkably like personal vanity. She stated that she would not surrender her regiments to accommodate a public relations strategy designed by corporate accountants. She looked directly at the blue ledger and told the table that, as far as she was concerned, the document belonged in the fireplace. The tension in the library had reached an absolute peak. The administrative briefing had completely collapsed into a raw debate about loyalty, duty, and institutional respect. The ledger sat between them like a ticking bomb, its corporate jargon completely useless in the face of 50 years of unyielding royal tradition and personal pride. The next move belonged entirely to the king, whose silence was about to break in the most spectacular fashion. 30 years of hidden rivalry explodes. The silver clock on the mantelpiece chimed the half hour. The sound did not break the frost in the room. The dispute on this Tuesday morning was not just about 3 military titles or a blue leather binder. It was the sudden, public eruption of an icy rivalry that had been simmering quietly beneath the surface of the royal family for more than 5 decades. The roots of this tension stretched all the way back to the early 1970s, long before either woman held a formal title within the palace walls. The historical facts were deeply woven into their shared social circle. In 1970, a young Princess Anne had formed a close romantic relationship with a dashing cavalry officer named Andrew Parker Bowles. The relationship was intense but short-lived, constrained by the rigid expectations of the royal marriage laws of that era. Shortly after their parting, Andrew turned his attention toward a young woman named Camilla Shand. The two were married in 1973, a development that permanently entangled the social dynamics of the inner court. For decades, Anne had viewed Camilla through a lens of strict institutional skepticism. Anne had been raised under the unyielding work ethic of the wartime generation, embodying the stoic, silent dedication of her father, Prince Philip. She valued discretion, absolute loyalty to the crown, and a complete absence of personal drama. To Anne, the chaotic romantic entanglements of the 1980s and 90s had been an unnecessary, deeply damaging stain on the reputation of the monarchy. She had watched her mother endure years of public scrutiny caused by those private choices. Camilla was entirely aware of this underlying judgment. Since her formal entry into the royal family in 2005, she had worked relentlessly to establish her own legitimacy. She had quietly endured years of hostile press coverage, slowly building a portfolio of serious charities focused on literacy and support for victims of domestic abuse. She felt she had earned her place at the top of the hierarchy through sheer endurance and loyalty to Charles. The Blue Ledger was her attempt to finally consolidate that hard-won authority, streamlining the household to reflect her status as queen consort. The confrontation turned deeply personal when Camilla made a remark about the crown's traditional methods. She suggested that the old way of doing things, where individual royals accumulated hundreds of minor patronages simply to boost statistics, was no longer respected by modern taxpayers. She stated that the public wanted to see a focused, modern team delivering high-impact results, not an endless series of brief ribbon-cutting ceremonies in obscure villages. The comment was a direct attack on Anne's entire life's work. Anne did not attempt to mask her anger. She countered that those obscure villages were the true foundation of the British monarchy. She stated that the family's survival did not depend on glamorous media campaigns designed in London offices. It depended on the long-term trust built by showing up year after year for ordinary people. regardless of whether a television camera was present. She looked directly at Camilla and noted that some people had spent their lives serving the crown, while others had spent their lives trying to secure it. The line hit the room like a physical blow. The senior household secretaries near the door looked down at their notebooks, their faces turning pale. The phrase was an explicit reference to the long, painful road Camilla had traveled to achieve her current position. It tore away the polite facade that the family had carefully maintained for 20 years, exposing the raw, unhealed resentment that still lingered from the turbulent days of the marriage breakdowns. Charles remained trapped between the two most influential women in his life. On one side was his wife, who provided the emotional support he required to endure the immense burdens of his current reign. On the other side was his sister, his closest lifelong confidant and the most dependable pillar of his administration. He knew that both women were fiercely intelligent, fiercely stubborn, and completely unwilling to yield a single inch of ground in front of the household staff. The internal tension grew heavier as Anne revealed a final piece of hidden information. She stated that she had spoken privately with her brother at Burke Hall during the summer recess. During that quiet conversation away from palace advisors, Charles had explicitly promised her that her traditional military honors and patronages would remain completely untouched during his lifetime. He had assured her that her status as the Princess Royal would always be fully respected under his administration. Camilla turned her head sharply toward her husband. Her eyes demanded an immediate explanation. This revelation proved that the king had been making contradictory promises behind closed doors, trying to please both his wife and his sister to avoid a domestic conflict. He had allowed Camilla's office to spend months drafting the modernization ledger, while secretly assuring Anne that no changes would ever take place. The duplicity was out in the open, and the monarch was completely out of options. The air in the library felt suffocatingly thin. The administrative briefing had completely transcended the boundaries of a normal policy dispute, transforming into a historical reckoning. 30 years of polite smiles, forced public appearances, and suppressed family grievances were exploding across the mahogany table. The secretaries stood frozen, terrified to move, realizing they were witnessing a moment of absolute vulnerability that could permanently damage the internal stability of the current reign. The king reaches his breaking point. The silver inkwell in the center of the mahogany table vibrated as King Charles slammed his open palm downward. The slap was loud, like a pistol shot echoing off the high, book-lined walls of the library. It was a physical outburst that completely shattered the rigid, centuries-old protocol of the Windsor household. Royal family disputes are traditionally handled with cold glares, clipped whispers, and coded memos passed between courtiers. They are never handled with open, physical fury in front of the lower-level staff. The king did not look at his wife. He did not look at his sister. He stood up so quickly that his heavy upholstered chair scraped violently backward against the polished oak floorboards. His face had turned a deep, alarming crimson beneath the bright morning light coming through the tall windows. His breathing was heavy, ragged, and audible to every single person frozen in the room. His hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides, the large gold signet ring catching the light. He shouted one single word that caused the 3 household secretaries by the door to drop their heads instantly. Enough! The word was delivered at full volume, completely untamed by his usual modulated public-speaking tone. For a second, the only sound in the entire room was the ticking of the mantelpiece clock and the heavy rasp of the monarch's breath. Charles began to pace the length of the long Persian rug, his leather shoes thudding heavily against the wool. He walked from the portrait of King George III over to the display case of historic medals, his movements erratic and filled with a lifetime of pent-up frustration. He began to speak in rapid, short sentences, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. He told them that he was carrying the weight of an entire state transition on his shoulders. He reminded the 2 women that the daily red boxes from Downing Street were piling up on his desk downstairs untouched. He mentioned the intense pressure of his ongoing medical treatments, the constant international scrutiny, and the public division caused by his younger son's media campaigns in America. He looked at Camilla, then turned sharply to Anne, asking them how they could drag him into a petty, domestic civil war over spreadsheets when the very survival of the crown was being questioned by the modern public. He pointed a shaking finger directly at the dark blue ledger sitting in the center of the table. He called it a piece of corporate garbage that was tearing his family apart. He stated that he was sick of being managed by public relations consultants, sick of being managed by aggressive advisors, and completely sick of the constant maneuvering for influence inside his own home. He looked at his sister and told her that he had enough global crises to manage without having to arbitrate a 50-year-old social rivalry every single time they sat down for a routine morning briefing. Anne did not flinch, but her posture tightened even further, her chin lifting slightly in deflated surprise. Camilla looked down at her lap, her fingers gripping the strap of her handbag so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Neither woman had expected the king to snap with such total, unpolished, raw emotion. He had always been a man who preferred diplomacy, quiet reflection, and avoidance of direct confrontation. This sudden, volcanic eruption proved that the boundaries of his psychological endurance had been completely breached. Charles stopped pacing and leaned over the table, placing his weight on his knuckles. He looked directly at the senior administrative aide who had brought the book into the room. He did not use the polite, formal phrasing expected of a monarch addressing a member of the royal household. He issued a harsh, direct command. He told the aide to take the ledger out of his sight, to cancel the remainder of the afternoon schedule, and to order every single person who did not carry the blood royal to clear out of the room immediately. The command triggered an instant, quiet panic among the staff. The secretaries did not wait for a second instruction. They gathered their digital tablets and paper folders with frantic, silent movements. They backed toward the heavy double doors, their eyes fixed firmly on the carpet to avoid making eye contact with the furious king. They knew that witnessing a monarch lose his temper to this extent was a dangerous position for an employee. In the palace machinery, knowing too much about the raw, human vulnerabilities of the principal royals can end a career faster than incompetence. A junior page, who had been standing by the side entrance to manage the tea service, became trapped in the corner. He had been trying to discreetly clear away a silver tray of biscuits when the shouting began. He stood frozen against the wood paneling, his face entirely pale, terrified that any movement would draw the king's wrath directly toward him. Charles noticed him, pointed toward the door, and barked a final order for total privacy. The page dropped his tongs onto the tray with a loud clatter, muttered an apology, and fled into the corridor. The heavy oak door shut behind him with a dull, echoing thud, leaving the three family members alone in the sudden, suffocating silence of the locked library. The palace clears out. The heavy oak doors of the king's private library clicked shut with a sound that felt final. In the long, carpeted corridor outside, the sudden silence of the hallway was almost deafening. The three senior household secretaries and the junior page stood huddled together against the crimson wallpaper. None of them spoke. Their breathing was fast, their faces pale under the bright electric sconces of the gallery. For several long seconds, they simply looked at one another, listening to see if any more shouting would cut through the thick wood panels. The administrative aide who had carried the dark blue ledger was the first to break the paralysis. He looked down at his watch. It was exactly 10:35. The schedule for the day was now in total ruins. Downstairs in the state drawing room, the high-level delegation from the Commonwealth Secretariat had been sitting for over 40 minutes. They were drinking mineral water and reading briefing notes, completely unaware that the monarch had just experienced a total psychological breakdown 2 floors above them. The aide turned to the senior secretary and whispered a direct instruction. He told her to go downstairs immediately and inform the diplomats that the king had been delayed due to an urgent, unexpected matter of state. He emphasized that she must use the standard diplomatic phrasing. She must mention a sudden telephone conference with the foreign secretary to explain the delay. Under no circumstances could any hint of the domestic dispute leave the building. The palace public relations strategy depended entirely on maintaining a facade of calm, professional governance. As the secretary hurried toward the grand staircase, the remaining staff members moved into the private administrative offices located in the north wing of Windsor Castle. The environment inside the office was chaotic. The internal telephone lines were already lighting up. Word of the king's outburst had not leaked to the press yet, but the sudden, frantic exit of the staff from the library had sent a shockwave through the internal household network. Aides from the Queen's press office at Clarence House were calling to ask why the afternoon calendar updates had been abruptly frozen on the internal server. The tech team inside the palace was ordered to take an unprecedented step. the director of household security initiated a temporary lockdown on the internal digital messaging network. All personal emails and text messages sent from within the castle grounds were placed under an automatic filtering protocol for the next 3 hours. The measure was extreme, usually reserved for major national security crises or sudden royal deaths. It was designed to prevent any junior staff member from sending a quick gossipy text to a reporter or a family member outside the walls. The institution was pulling down its digital shutters to contain the emotional fallout. Meanwhile, the junior page who had been trapped in the corner with the biscuit tray was led into a small private office by the master of the household. The page was a 22-year-old worker who had only joined the royal service 4 months prior. He was visibly shaking, terrified that he was about to be dismissed from his post for witnessing his employer's raw fury. The master of the household sat him down and pushed a glass of water across the desk. He did not threaten the young man. He spoke to him in a quiet, intense tone, reminding him of the strict non-disclosure agreement he had signed upon his hiring. He explained that what happened in the library was an entirely private family matter, driven by the intense pressures of the king's high office. He told the page that his continued employment at the palace depended entirely on his ability to completely erase the last 15 minutes from his memory. The page nodded rapidly, swallowing hard, and swore absolute, total secrecy. Back in the corridor outside the library, the physical reality of the situation was settling in. The private secretaries realized they had to manage the logistics of a divided household for the rest of the day. The king's calendar was completely blanked for the afternoon, but Camilla and Anne still had independent commitments that required transport and security details. The transport office in the Royal Mews had to quickly rearrange the car deployments to ensure that the two women would not cross paths in the courtyard when leaving the estate. By 11 o'clock, the mystery of how the financial ledger had been created behind Anne's back began to clarify. An administrative assistant in the financial office discovered a digital trail on the shared network. The corporate consultancy firm that designed the streamlining strategy had been granted access to the royal archives 3 months earlier via a digital token issued directly by Camilla's private secretary. The paperwork showed that the project had been logged under the codename Project Vanguard. It had been funded entirely through a private account controlled by the Queen's office, completely bypassing the standard oversight committees that Anne traditionally chaired. This discovery confirmed that the confrontation was not a sudden misunderstanding. It was a long-planned, systematic attempt by the Queen's team to alter the balance of power within the working core of the family. They had used private funds to hire external corporate analysts to build a case for cutting Anne's portfolio, presenting it as an objective, modern necessity rather than a personal choice. The strategy had been designed to give Charles a ready-made plan that he could simply sign off on, but they had severely underestimated the king's psychological exhaustion and Anne's deep network of intelligence within the household staff. Downstairs, the secretary managed to successfully dismiss the Commonwealth delegation, rescheduling the meeting for the following Thursday afternoon. The diplomats left the castle through the quadrangle, their black cars driving slowly past the sentry boxes. As the vehicles disappeared through the main gates, a heavy quiet descended over the entire estate. The staff moved through the hallways on tiptoe, speaking only in whispers. The mechanism of the palace was still operating, but its core had been completely paralyzed by the realization that the monarch's composure was no longer absolute. The locked doors of the library remained closed, holding the secrets of a family meeting that had permanently shattered the domestic peace of the reign. The icy aftermath and silent pacts. The heavy double doors of the private library finally opened at exactly 12:45. Queen Camilla emerged first. She did not look at the two security officers stationed at the end of the gallery. Her face was completely expressionless, masked by decades of training in public composure. She walked with a rapid, deliberate stride down the long corridor toward her private apartments in the West Wing. Her personal secretary immediately followed 2 steps behind, carrying her discarded leather briefcase. Within 20 minutes, a silver hybrid vehicle was spotted leaving the Windsor Castle Royal Mews, heading down the long walk toward Clarence House in London. The Queen was withdrawing from the estate alone, leaving the King behind. 5 minutes later, Princess Anne exited the library. Her demeanor was entirely different. She stopped to address the master of the household who was waiting near the grand staircase. Her voice was perfectly calm, crisp, and businesslike, as if the explosive shouting match had never occurred. She gave a direct instruction regarding her travel arrangements for the following morning. She was scheduled to open a new research facility in Aberdeenshire, and she made it clear that her itinerary would proceed exactly as planned, without a single alteration or delay. She had defended her portfolio, and her body language signaled absolute victory. The true resolution of the crisis occurred in the final 20 minutes of that locked room meeting after Camilla had walked out. Left alone with his sister, King Charles had reached a quiet, binding agreement. The facts of the conversation were later confirmed by a senior administrative source. The king officially revoked his verbal support for Project Vanguard. He gave Anne a firm, written guarantee that her military titles and charity patronages would remain completely protected under his administration. In return, Anne agreed to help her brother manage the growing backlog of state paperwork, stepping in to chair several upcoming Privy Council meetings to ease his physical burden. The sibling bond had survived the storm, but the strategic layout of the household had been permanently altered. The psychological fallout inside the palace took weeks to clear. The household staff remained on high alert, carefully managing the internal communications to ensure that no details of the king's outburst ever reached the British tabloid press. The dark blue corporate ledger was quietly removed from the master schedule and placed in a secure vault within the royal archives, never to be implemented. The power struggle had ended in a decisive stalemate. Camilla had established her boundaries as queen consort, but Anne had proven that 50 years of unyielding duty could not be dismantled by corporate accountants. The fragile peace inside the palace walls was restored, but the memory of the king's raw, unfiltered fury remained burned into the minds of every courtier who stood in the hallway on that unforgettable Tuesday morning. The power struggle behind the palace walls reveals the immense human cost of maintaining a modern monarchy. King Charles's sudden outburst proved that even the most disciplined royals have a breaking point when duty and family loyalty collide. Princess Anne's decades of service remained untouched, but the internal dynamics of the court changed forever on that quiet Tuesday morning.